Hello my dear adventurers. Welcome back to our cozy haven where the whispers of the world fade into gentle echoes and dreams of magic await. Tonight, I invite you to journey with me into the heart of Ireland's most enduring mystery, to explore the legend of those elusive little folk who have captured imaginations for over 1,000 years. So settle in, find that comfortable spot where the glow of your hearth warms the cool night air, and let us delve deep into the enchanting world of leprechauns and their hidden gold. Picture yourself walking through the misty Irish countryside on a spring morning, where ancient hedgerows line narrow country lanes and the air is thick with the scent of wildflowers and damp earth. The world feels hushed, as though nature herself is holding her breath. And then, faint as a whisper on the wind, you hear it. A rhythmic tapping sound, steady and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. The unmistakable sound of a tiny hammer striking leather, echoing from somewhere beyond the brambles. Your heart quickens, for you know, as every Irish soul knows, that this is the telltale sign of a leprechaun at work, cobbling away in solitude, guarding secrets that have enchanted and confounded humankind for centuries. The leprechaun stands as one of Ireland's most recognizable symbols. Yet the creature we think we know, the cheerful little fellow in green with his pot of gold at rainbow's end, is but a shadow of a far more complex and fascinating figure. To truly understand the leprechaun, we must journey back through the mists of time, back to when Ireland was young and the boundary between this world and the other world was as thin as morning mist over a quiet bog. We must explore not just what the leprechaun has become, but what he once was, and why his legend has endured when so many other fairy folk have faded into obscurity. Tonight's tale will take us through forests where ancient magic still lingers, down into underground halls where treasure gleams in the darkness, and into the hearts and minds of countless storytellers who have kept the leprechaun's legend alive through generations of telling and retelling. We will uncover truths that have been buried beneath centuries of myth and misrepresentation. We will separate the authentic folklore from the commercial invention. And perhaps, just perhaps, we might catch a glimpse of why these solitary fairies have maintained their grip on human imagination for so very long. So let the cares of the day drift away, dear friends. Let your breathing slow and your mind open to possibility. For we are about to embark on a journey that will reveal the leprechaun not as a cartoon character or a St. Patrick's Day decoration, but as a genuine piece of Ireland's spiritual and cultural heritage, a being who embodies the Irish relationship with the land, with luck, with cunning, and with that thin veil that separates the everyday world from realms of magic and mystery. Ancient origins, from gods to fairies. To understand the leprechaun, we must first journey back to a time when Ireland belonged to the gods themselves. Long before the Celts set foot upon the Emerald Isle, long before St. Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland's shores, there existed a race of supernatural beings known as the Tuatha Dé Danann. Their name means the people of the goddess Danu, and according to the ancient mythological cycles of Ireland, they were not merely powerful, they were divine. The Tuatha Dé Danann were gods and goddesses in their own right, beings of tremendous power who ruled Ireland with wisdom, magic, and martial prowess that no mortal could match. These were the beings who brought four great treasures to Ireland from the mysterious northern cities of Fáilias, Gorias, Muireas, and Fáinias. They possessed the Stone of Destiny that would cry out when the rightful king of Ireland stood upon it. They wielded the Spear of Luff that guaranteed victory in battle. They owned the Sword of Light that no enemy could escape. And they guarded the Cauldron of the Dagda from which no company ever went away unsatisfied. The Tuatha Dé Danann were masters of craftsmanship and magic, renowned throughout the ancient world for their supernatural skills in building, metalwork, and all the arts that made civilization possible. But even gods cannot remain unchanged forever. When the mortal Milesians, the ancestors of the Irish people, invaded Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann were defeated in battle. Yet they did not leave their beloved land. Instead, according to legend, they struck a bargain with their conquerors. The Milesians would rule the land above, while the Tuatha Dé Danann would retreat beneath the earth, into the hollow hills and ancient burial mounds known as the Scythe. There they would remain, dwelling in the otherworld, in that mysterious realm that exists parallel to our own, separated by the thinnest of veils. And here is where the transformation began. The great poet William Butler Yeats, who spent much of his life collecting and studying Irish folklore, described this change with haunting clarity. The pagan gods of Ireland, he explained, robbed of worship and offerings as Christianity spread across the land, grew smaller and smaller in the popular imagination until they turned into the fairies. What were once mighty deities became the wee folk, the little people, the fairy folk who dwelt in raths and forts and beneath the hawthorn trees that dotted the Irish countryside. This diminishment, this shrinking of the gods, was not merely physical but spiritual and cultural. It represented Ireland's transition from a pagan past into a Christian present, a way for the old beliefs to survive by transforming into something new, something that could coexist with the new religion without directly challenging it. The gods became fairies, and among these fairies, certain types emerged as distinct beings with their own characteristics, their own territories, their own peculiar habits and occupations. Some scholars have proposed a fascinating connection between the leprechaun and Luff himself, one of the greatest of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Luff was known as Luff Lamfada, Luff of the Long Arm, and he was celebrated as a master of all arts and crafts. He was a warrior, a craftsman, a poet, a musician, and a sorcerer all in one. When the Tuatha Dé Danann needed a champion to face the monstrous Fomorians, it was Luff who stepped forward. He was the god of light, of skill, of mastery over all forms of knowledge and craftsmanship. The theory suggests that from this mighty god, the humble leprechaun may have descended. The very name leprechaun could preserve an echo of this divine origin, if this interpretation holds true. While there are many theories about the etymology of the word, some of the most intriguing spellings found in Old Irish texts include Luharkin and Lugrican, names that appear to incorporate Luff within them. This has led some scholars, notably Peter Beresford Ellis, to suggest a direct linguistic link. If this connection is genuine, we might imagine the transformation. The great king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, master of all skills, shrinking down through the centuries until he became the solitary fairy cobbler, still practicing his craft but on a far more modest scale, making shoes for the fairy folk instead of leading armies into battle. But Luff is not the only possible ancestor of the leprechaun. There is another, even older source that may have contributed to the leprechaun legend, one that takes us back to the 8th century and to one of the oldest surviving pieces of Irish literature. The tale is called Ectra Fergusa Maic Leti, the adventure of Fergus son of Leti, and it tells of Fergus, king of Ulster, who one night fell asleep on a beach. While he slumbered, tiny water sprites called Luquap or Lucapane, a name meaning small bodies, crept up on the sleeping king. These diminutive creatures attempted to drag Fergus into the sea, but the touch of water on his feet awakened him. Quick as lightning, Fergus seized 3 of the sprites before they could escape. The captured Lucapane bargained for their freedom, and in exchange for their release, they granted Fergus the magical ability to swim and breathe underwater. But there was a caveat to this gift, one strange exception that would ultimately prove fatal. Fergus could travel through any water except Loch Rudrage. This ancient tale, preserved in manuscripts over 1,000 years old, gives us our earliest written reference to creatures that share many characteristics with the later leprechaun. They are small, they possess magical powers, they can be captured, and when caught they will bargain with mortals, granting supernatural gifts in exchange for their freedom. These water sprites, these ancient Lucapane, seem to have merged over the centuries with other fairy traditions. Some sources speak of household fairies who haunted cellars and drank heavily, mischievous sprites who would plague homeowners if they felt slighted or neglected. These cellar-dwelling fairies may have contributed the leprechaun's connection to wealth and hidden treasure, for they were said to know the locations of gold and silver buried long ago by raiders and invaders who never returned to claim their plunder. And plunder there was in abundance. From the late 8th century onward, waves of Viking raiders swept down upon Ireland's coasts. These Norsemen came in their longships seeking treasure, and they found it in the monasteries and settlements they pillaged. Gold, silver, precious objects of all kinds. These the Vikings took and often buried for safekeeping, planning to return for their loot when it was safe to do so. But war is an uncertain business, and many of these raiders never did return. Their treasure remained hidden, buried in secret places, marked only in the failing memories of dead men. According to legend, it was the Leprechauns who discovered these abandoned hoards. The little folk, dwelling as they did beneath the earth, in intimate connection with every rock and root and hidden space in Ireland's soil, they found the forgotten gold. And being prudent creatures, they gathered it up and hid it again, but this time hid it so well that no human could ever find it. Unless, of course, that human could catch a leprechaun and force him to reveal its location. And therein lies the eternal game, the dance between human greed and fairy cunning that has been played out in countless stories over countless generations. So we see that the leprechaun is no simple creation, no single source can claim him entirely. He is instead a confluence, a meeting point of multiple traditions. He carries within him the divine craftsmanship of Luff, the ancient magic of the Leprechauns water sprites, the mischievousness of household fairies, and the guardianship of Viking gold. He is, in essence, a perfect embodiment of Ireland's layered history, a being who has absorbed and reflected the various peoples and periods that have shaped the island's story. From gods to fairies, from water to earth, from divine kings to cunning cobblers, the leprechaun has travelled a long and winding road through Irish mythology and folklore. And yet, for all this ancient heritage, the leprechaun did not always occupy the prominent place in Irish consciousness that he holds today. In the medieval manuscripts that preserved Ireland's mythological cycles, creatures that could be identified as leprechauns appear only rarely. The great heroes like Cúl Cullen, the mighty queens like Maeve, the divine figures like the Dagda and the Morrigan, these were the stars of the old tales. The little folk, the solitary fairies, they lurked in the margins, in the less grand stories, in the oral traditions of country folk rather than in the courts of kings and the halls of learned bards. It was not until much later, particularly in the 19th century, that the leprechaun stepped forward from the shadows to claim his place as one of Ireland's most recognizable symbols. But that is a story for later in our journey. For now, we have established the deep roots, the ancient origins, the transformation of gods into fairies and the emergence of the leprechaun from the mists of Irish mythology. These foundations, laid down over thousands of years, created the soil in which the leprechaun legend would flourish and grow into the rich tradition we know today. The etymology of leprechaun. Language is a living thing, changing and evolving with each generation that speaks it, and nowhere is this more evident than in the many forms that the word leprechaun has taken throughout its long history. To trace the etymology of leprechaun is to embark on a journey through the development of the Irish language itself, from Old Irish through Middle Irish to the modern forms used today. And in this linguistic journey, we find clues not just to the word's origin, but to the very nature of the creature it describes. The modern Irish spelling is leprechaun, pronounced roughly leprechaun, though regional variations abound across Ireland's 4 provinces. But this standardized form is a relatively recent development. In the centuries before spelling became fixed, when most Irish was spoken rather than written, the name of the leprechaun appeared in dozens of different forms, each one reflecting the local accent and pronunciation of different regions and different eras. In Ulster, the northern province, the creature was known as the leprechaun. Travel south to Connaught and you would hear him called the leprechaun. Journey southeast to Leinster and the name becomes leprechaun, or perhaps leprechaun, or any of several similar variations. And down in Munster, the southwestern province, people spoke of the Lurgadon. All of these names, different as they sound, all refer to the same creature. They are regional dialects preserving the same word in slightly different forms, like variations on a musical theme played in different keys. The earliest written forms of the name that we have are found in medieval Irish texts. Here we encounter Luchrapan and Lucorpan and similar spellings, names that clearly descend from even older roots. And when we dig back into Old Irish, the ancient form of the language spoken over 1,000 years ago, we find what may be the original form of the word, Lucorpan or Leprechaun. These ancient names are compound words, built from two elements that tell us something fundamental about how the Irish people originally conceived of these creatures. The first element, Lu, means small in Old Irish. The second element, corp, means body. It was borrowed into Irish from the Latin corpus, a borrowing that speaks to the early influence of Roman Christianity on Irish culture and language. So Lucorpan, in its most literal translation, means small body. It is a descriptive name, telling us simply and directly what these creatures were: small-bodied beings, diminutive entities, little folk. This etymology is widely accepted among scholars as the most likely origin of the word leprechaun. It fits the linguistic evidence, it matches the physical description of the creatures in folklore, and it traces back through demonstrable stages of the Irish language's development. But there are other theories, other possibilities that have been suggested over the years, and some of these are quite fascinating in their own right, even if they are less likely to be correct. One popular folk etymology connects the leprechaun to his traditional occupation. The Irish words leith brogan mean shoemaker, or more literally, half shoe or one shoe. This has led some to theorize that Leithbrogan, one of the variant spellings of leprechaun found in some texts, actually derives from this shoemaking connection. The idea is appealing because leprechauns are so consistently associated with cobbling in folklore, always depicted at their work making shoes for the fairy folk, always with hammer in hand and leather at their feet. However, most modern scholars consider this shoemaker etymology to be what linguists call a folk etymology, a false origin story that people created after the fact to explain a word whose true origin had been forgotten. The theory is that people knew leprechauns were cobblers, saw a similarity between Leithbrogan and Leith Brogan, and assumed a connection that was never really there. It is a case of etymology following folklore, rather than folklore following etymology. Nevertheless, the association is ancient enough and strong enough that it cannot be dismissed entirely, and it certainly tells us something important about how people thought about leprechauns, whether or not it tells us where the word actually came from. An even more intriguing theory connects the leprechaun to Lugh himself, the great god of the Tuatha Dé Danann. As we discussed earlier, some of the medieval spellings of leprechaun include Luharkan and Lugrakan. To some scholars, these spellings are too close to the name Lugh to be coincidental. The theory suggests that Luharkan could mean something like Little Lugh or Luffling, representing the diminished form of the once great god. It would be the perfect name for a creature who descended from divinity, but now exists as a mere fairy, still practicing the skills and crafts that Lugh mastered, but on a far smaller scale and in far humbler circumstances. Peter Beresford Ellis, a respected scholar of Celtic culture and history, has argued passionately for this Lugh connection, seeing in the leprechaun not just a distant descendant of the god, but a direct linguistic preservation of his name. If this theory is correct, then every time we say leprechaun, we are, in a sense, invoking the memory of one of ancient Ireland's greatest deities, keeping alive in folklore what was lost in formal religion. There is yet another etymological theory worth mentioning, one put forward in the 19th century by the folklorist Thomas Cately. Cately noticed similarities between the Irish leprechaun and certain English folkloric figures, particularly a type of sprite sometimes called a lubber or lob. He argued that the Irish name might actually derive from English sources, perhaps from loblie by the fire, a household sprite mentioned in 17th century English literature. Cately suggested that leprechaun could be a corruption of lubberkin, a diminutive form of lubber. This theory requires us to imagine linguistic borrowing in the opposite direction from what we usually assume, with Irish adopting and adapting an English word rather than the other way around. It is a theory that found little support among subsequent scholars, and today it is largely dismissed. But it is interesting as a reminder that in the Celtic lands, English and Irish cultures have long intermingled and influenced each other in complex ways, and untangling these influences is not always straightforward. What becomes clear from this survey of etymological possibilities is that the leprechaun's very name is contested territory, fought over by competing theories and interpretations. This is perhaps fitting for a creature who is himself so slippery, so hard to pin down, so resistant to easy categorization. The leprechaun's name, like the leprechaun himself, seems to shift and change depending on where you are, when you are, and who is telling the story. Across different regions of Ireland, the leprechaun was not just called by different names, he was sometimes thought of as different beings entirely. The regional variations we see in the name sometimes reflected real differences in the folklore. The creature known in one county might have somewhat different characteristics from his counterpart in another county. These regional variations are part of what makes Irish folklore so rich and complex, a reminder that these were living traditions, shaped by local geography, local history, local imagination. And yet, through all these variations, certain core elements remain constant. Whether you call him leprechaun or leprechaun or lurgadan, whether you trace his name to small body, or to shoemaker, or to the god Luff himself, the creature described is recognizably the same: a solitary fairy, a skilled craftsman, a guardian of hidden treasure, a being capable of great magic but also of great mischief, someone who might help you or might trick you, depending on his mood and your approach. The name may change, but the nature remains. In the modern era, leprechaun has become standardized, particularly in English-speaking countries where the Irish form leprechaun is little known. This standardization is part of a broader process by which Irish folklore has been codified, simplified, and in some ways diminished. The rich regional variations that once existed, the subtle differences between the leprechaun of Connaught and the lurgadan of Munster, these have been largely smoothed away in favor of a single, uniform image of the leprechaun. We have gained clarity and recognizability, perhaps, but at the cost of some of that marvelous regional diversity that once characterized Irish fairy lore. Still, the fact that we can trace the word back through so many forms, through so many centuries, is itself remarkable. It speaks to the endurance of the leprechaun legend, to its deep roots in Irish culture. Language scholars can follow the thread of this word backward through time, watching it evolve and change with each generation, each shift in pronunciation and spelling preserving a snapshot of how the Irish language itself was spoken at that moment. In this way, the etymology of leprechaun becomes not just a linguistic puzzle, but a window into Irish cultural history, a way of seeing how Ireland and its people have changed over the centuries while somehow remaining fundamentally themselves. Physical appearance through the ages. If you were to ask someone today to describe a leprechaun, chances are the description would be remarkably consistent. A tiny old man, no more than a few feet tall, dressed head to toe in bright green with a jaunty top hat, sporting a red beard and a mischievous grin, perhaps with a pipe clenched between his teeth and a shamrock pinned to his lapel. This is the leprechaun of popular imagination, the leprechaun of St. Patrick's Day decorations and breakfast cereal boxes, the leprechaun that has become one of the world's most recognizable symbols of Ireland. But this familiar image, this green-clad sprite we all think we know, is actually a relatively modern invention. If you could travel back in time and describe this green leprechaun to someone in 18th or 19th century Ireland, they would look at you with confusion. That is not what a leprechaun looks like at all, they would tell you. And they would be right, at least according to the authentic folklore of their time. The true leprechaun, the leprechaun of genuine Irish tradition, looked quite different from his modern counterpart. The earliest detailed descriptions we have of leprechauns come from the 19th century, a time when folklorists and antiquarians were racing to record the oral traditions of rural Ireland before modernization swept them away. What they recorded was remarkably consistent. Leprechauns were not dressed in green. They wore red. Red coats, red jackets, red waistcoats. This was the dominant color associated with leprechauns in authentic Irish folklore. Samuel Lover, an Irish novelist and songwriter, published his Legends and Stories of Ireland in 1831, and in it he described the leprechaun's appearance in vivid detail. According to Lover, the leprechaun was quite a beau in his dress, wearing a red square-cut coat, richly laced with gold, and inexpressible of the same, cocked hat, shoes and buckles. This is a very different figure from our modern green sprite. This leprechaun is elegantly dressed in the fashion of an earlier era, a small gentleman in red and gold, someone who takes pride in his appearance and maintains high standards of sartorial excellence. William Butler Yeats, who spent decades collecting Irish folklore and fairy tales, provided even more specific details about leprechaun attire in his writings. Yeats explained that in Irish fairy lore, solitary fairies like leprechauns wore red jackets, while trooping fairies, those who moved in groups and companies, wore green. This was a meaningful distinction in the Irish fairy tradition, a way of marking the difference between different types of fairy folk. The leprechaun, being supremely solitary, would naturally wear red. But Yeats gave us even more detail than this. He described how a leprechaun's jacket would have 7 rows of buttons, with 7 buttons in each row. That is 49 buttons total, a level of detail that suggests these descriptions came from people who had genuinely seen leprechauns, or at least genuinely believed they had. Why 7 rows of 7? The number 7 has always held magical significance in Celtic tradition, and this multiplication of 7s would imbue the leprechaun's clothing with powerful symbolic weight. The style of clothing varied somewhat from region to region, just as the name did. In Ulster, the northern province, leprechauns were sometimes described as wearing military-style coats, as though they were tiny soldiers of the fairy realm. On the wild western coast, where the Atlantic winds blow cold and fierce, leprechauns wore warm frieze jackets to protect against the weather. In Tipperary, they appeared in antique slashed jackets, a style that had gone out of fashion centuries before but persisted in the timeless realm of the fairies. And the Leprechauns, a close cousin of the leprechaun found in Monaghan and elsewhere, wore a swallow-tailed evening coat, dressed for a night of drinking and merrymaking. The hat was another important element of the leprechaun's ensemble. The cocked hat or tricorn hat appears frequently in descriptions, a 3-cornered hat popular in the 18th century, but long outdated by the time these accounts were being recorded. Some accounts describe the hat as particularly important when the leprechaun was up to mischief. Yeats recorded a tradition from Ulster that when a leprechaun was planning some unusually elaborate trick, he would leap onto a wall and spin on the point of his hat with his heels in the air. One can only imagine what such a sight must have looked like, this tiny figure whirling like a top, suspended impossibly on his hat point, defying every law of physics in his glee. The shoes, naturally, were always of the finest quality. As the fairy cobbler, the leprechaun would never be caught wearing inferior footwear. His shoes were made from the best leather, polished until they gleamed, buckled with silver or brass buckles that caught the light. So well polished were these shoes that, according to tradition, you could see your reflection in them even on a moonless night. This detail speaks to the leprechaun's pride in his craft. He made shoes for others, but he also made them for himself, and his own shoes were living advertisements of his skill. Beyond the clothing, the leprechaun's physical form was also quite different from the jolly little figure of modern imagination. In authentic folklore, leprechauns were not cute or cherubic. They were described as wizened, wrinkled old men with crabbed faces, often with white or red beards rather than the universally red hair of modern depictions. Their faces were the faces of men who had lived for countless years, accumulating wrinkles and weathering like ancient wood left out in the elements. There was something slightly disturbing about these faces, something that marked them as not quite human, as belonging to the other world. Their size varied somewhat in the accounts, but they were generally described as being between 2 and 3 feet tall, no bigger than a human child. Some accounts make them even smaller, barely larger than a man's hand. But even at 2 or 3 feet, they were small enough to hide easily, to slip through gaps that a human could never fit through, to live in the hidden spaces of the world that we overlook. The demeanor of the leprechaun in these older accounts was also markedly different from his modern portrayal. He was not a friendly, helpful figure. He was described as crabby, cranky, solitary by nature and preference, someone who would rather be left alone to his work. If disturbed, he was likely to be cross about it. He had a sharp tongue and little patience for human foolishness. This was not a creature who wanted to be your friend or help you out of the goodness of his heart. Any help you got from a leprechaun would have to be extracted through force or cunning, and even then he would be looking for ways to wriggle out of his obligations. Some accounts describe leprechauns as appearing only at certain times, particularly at twilight, that magical hour when day transitions to night and the boundary between worlds grows thin. In the dying light of sunset, you might spot one sitting under a hedge or dock leaf, hammer in hand, working away at a tiny shoe. The fading light made them easier to see, but also harder to identify clearly, their small forms blending with the shadows and the gloaming. So when and how did this red-clad, cranky, ancient cobbler transform into the jolly green leprechaun we know today? The change happened gradually throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, driven by several overlapping forces. One factor was the rise of Irish nationalism and the increasing association of the colour green with Irish identity. As green became Ireland's colour, appearing on flags and in political symbolism, it was perhaps inevitable that Ireland's fairy folk would eventually don green as well. The change is reflected in literature and poetry. William Allingham's poem The Leprechaun, or Fairy Shoemaker, published in the 19th century, describes a leprechaun in green, and this poem was widely read and influential. As Irish literature became more popular, both in Ireland and abroad, these literary descriptions began to shape popular understanding of what leprechauns looked like, slowly overwriting the older oral traditions. The 20th century saw the process accelerate dramatically. When Walt Disney began developing what would become Darby O'Gill and the Little People in 1959, the film's leprechauns were dressed in green. This movie, with its impressive special effects and wide distribution, did more than perhaps any other single work to establish the modern image of the leprechaun in the popular imagination. After Disney, the green leprechaun became standard, and the red-coated figure of authentic folklore faded from memory. The commercialization of St. Patrick's Day, particularly in America, cemented the green leprechaun as the default image. As the holiday transformed from a religious feast day into a broader celebration of Irish heritage and culture, the leprechaun became one of its central symbols. And in this role, dressed in the green associated with Ireland, the leprechaun reached levels of recognition that he had never achieved in his original red coat. The modern leprechaun's personality also softened considerably. The cranky, misanthropic cobbler of folklore gave way to a more appealing figure, mischievous rather than mean-spirited, tricky rather than truly malicious. This was the leprechaun of Lucky Charms cereal, first introduced in 1964, a friendly if somewhat exasperating character who led children on harmless chases after his magically delicious cereal. It was the leprechaun of countless children's books, St. Patrick's Day decorations, and tourist trinkets. What was lost in this transformation was complexity. The original leprechaun, in his red coat and cocked hat, with his wrinkled face and surly disposition, was a figure of genuine folklore, a being who embodied certain aspects of the Irish imagination and the Irish relationship with the other world. He was sometimes helpful, sometimes harmful, always unpredictable. He belonged to a specific cultural context, to a worldview in which the fairies were real and nearby, not cute fantasies but genuine spiritual beings to be respected and, when necessary, feared. The green leprechaun of modern times is more accessible, more marketable, more suitable for children. But he is also, in many ways, less interesting. He has been domesticated, tamed, made safe for mass consumption. The genuine eeriness that characterized accounts of fairy encounters, the sense that these were meetings with beings from another realm who operated by different rules and whose ultimate motives were inscrutable, all of this has been largely lost. And yet, even in his modernized form, the leprechaun retains something of his original nature. He is still a trickster, still elusive, still associated with hidden treasure and impossible quests. The core of the legend survives even as its outward trappings have changed. Perhaps this is testament to the strength of the original folklore, to the enduring power of these stories to adapt to new times while maintaining their essential character. The leprechaun has survived by changing, by dressing in new clothes while keeping his old personality. And in doing so, he has ensured that his legend continues to capture imaginations, even if the image that now represents him would be scarcely recognizable to the Irish country folk who first told his tales. The solitary shoemaker, their craft and trade. Among all the fairy folk of Ireland, the leprechaun holds a unique distinction. He is the only one who works. While other fairies dance and feast and make mischief, while the trooping fairies ride out on their midnight revels, while the beanside wails her warnings and the puka leads travelers astray, the leprechaun works. Day in and day out, you will find him at his trade, hammer in hand, leather upon his lap, cobbling shoes with a skill and dedication that would put many a human craftsman to shame. This profession is so central to the leprechaun's identity that it provides one of the most reliable ways to detect his presence. For though leprechauns are masters of concealment, though they can make themselves invisible or blend into the landscape with supernatural ease, they cannot silence the sound of their work. The steady tap-tap-tap of the leprechaun's hammer striking leather echoes through the Irish countryside, a rhythmic beat that, once you recognize it, is unmistakable. William Allingham captured this sound beautifully in his poem The Leprechaun, or Fairy Shoemaker, writing, "Lay your ear close to the hill. Do you not catch the tiny clamour, busy click of an elfin hammer, voice of the leprechaun singing shrill, as he merrily plies his trade? This is how you find a leprechaun, not by searching with your eyes but by listening for that telltale tapping, following the sound to its source, approaching as silently as you can in hopes of catching him at his work before he vanishes into thin air." But why shoemaking? Why should the leprechaun, of all possible occupations, be a cobbler? The answer lies partly in the nature of the fairy folk themselves, and partly in the role of craftsmen in traditional Irish society. The Tuatha Dé Danann, from whom the leprechauns are descended, were renowned for their craftsmanship. They were builders and metalworkers, artists and artisans of surpassing skill. When they shrank into the fairy folk, they retained this connection to craft and making, to the transformation of raw materials into finished goods through skill and labor. And among all crafts, shoemaking holds a special place in fairy lore. For shoes are necessary things, and the fairy folk, in their endless dancing and their constant movement through the landscape, wear out shoes at a tremendous rate. William Butler Yeats explained this connection explicitly, noting that because fairies love dancing so much, they will constantly need shoes. He even recorded a tale about a woman who was spirited away by the fairies and returned 7 years later without her toes. She had literally danced them off during her time in Fairyland. So the leprechaun's profession makes perfect sense. The fairies need shoes, and someone must make them. The leprechaun is that someone, the cobbler to the fairy courts, the artisan who ensures that no fairy need go barefoot, no matter how vigorous their dancing. It is an essential role, one that requires both skill and dedication. And for the leprechaun, that solitary worker who prefers his own company to that of others, it is the perfect occupation. He can work alone, absorbed in his craft, disturbed only occasionally by the sound of his own hammer and the rustling of the wind through whatever hedge or hollow he has chosen as his workshop for the day. The tools of the leprechaun's trade are as carefully made as the shoes themselves. His hammer must be small enough to fit his tiny hands, but strong enough to drive tacks through the toughest leather. His awl for piercing holes, his knife for cutting, his thread for stitching, all must be precisely sized and maintained in perfect condition. These are not toys but genuine tools, miniature versions of what any human cobbler would use, but made with a care and precision that speaks to the leprechaun's perfectionism about his craft. The leather he works with is always of the finest quality, soft enough to be comfortable, strong enough to last through years of fairy dancing. The leather is cut and shaped with expert precision. The shoes he produces are marvels of tiny craftsmanship, perfect in every detail from sole to buckle. Some accounts speak of leprechauns decorating their fairy shoes with magical patterns or symbols, imbuing them with subtle enchantments that would help their wearers dance more lightly or travel more swiftly. But the leprechaun does not only make shoes for others. He makes them for himself as well, and his own shoes are always the finest examples of his art. Polished until they gleam, buckled with silver or brass, these shoes are more than footwear. They are statements of pride in one's craft, walking advertisements for the leprechaun's skill. The tradition that you could see your reflection in a leprechaun's shoes even on the darkest night speaks to the level of care he puts into maintaining his footwear. For a cobbler to wear shabby shoes would be an unthinkable disgrace. Some accounts suggest that leprechauns are always found making only a single shoe, never a pair. Dr. McAnally, in his 1888 work Irish Wonders, offered an explanation for this curious detail. He claimed that the leprechaun is not a professional cobbler at all, but is simply mending his own shoes, which he wears out with extraordinary frequency because he runs about so much. This interpretation paints the leprechaun as constantly on the move, wearing out his shoes faster than he can repair them, forever working on one shoe or the other, but never quite catching up. This image of the leprechaun as a traveler, constantly moving through the Irish landscape, fits well with his role as a guardian of hidden treasure. To know where gold is buried all across Ireland, to move between different hiding places, to evade capture by staying one step ahead of treasure hunters, all of this would indeed require a great deal of running about. And if you run that much, you will certainly wear out your shoes. But whether he makes shoes for others or only for himself, whether he is a true professional cobbler or merely an eternal tinkerer with his own footwear, the leprechaun's connection to shoemaking runs deep. It is part of his identity, as fundamental to who he is as his small size or his hidden gold. The image of the leprechaun at his work, sitting cross-legged under a hedge with leather spread across his lap and hammer in hand, is one of the most enduring and evocative in all of Irish folklore. The location of the leprechaun's workshop varies from tale to tale, but certain patterns emerge. He favors liminal spaces, boundaries and thresholds between different realms. Under hedges, at the edges of fields, near fairy forts and ancient burial mounds, these are the places where the leprechaun plies his trade. He works outdoors more often than in, though some accounts place him in caves or in the hollow trunks of old trees. The key is isolation. The leprechaun wants to work undisturbed, away from prying eyes, in places where he can hear anyone approaching long before they can sneak up on him. The time of day matters too. Twilight is particularly favored. Those hours when day fades into night and the world between light and darkness provides the perfect camouflage for a small figure working by the last rays of the sun. But leprechauns have also been spotted at midday, and occasionally even in the bright morning light. They work when the mood takes them, which given their immortal lifespans, might be at any hour. And what does the leprechaun earn for his labor? This is where the story becomes particularly interesting, for according to the folklore, the answer is gold. The tradition tells us that the fairies pay the leprechaun in gold coins for the shoes he makes. Over the course of centuries, perhaps millennia, the leprechaun would have accumulated a substantial fortune from his cobbling, and this fortune he keeps hidden, stored in a pot or crock buried in some secret location known only to himself. But here we must ask, why would the leprechaun need gold? What use is treasure to a being who lives apart from human society, who needs no shop or property, who apparently requires nothing more than his tools and his leather and a quiet spot to work? The fairies themselves seem to use gold only as decoration, as beautiful objects rather than as currency. So why does the leprechaun hoard his earnings so carefully, guarding his treasure with such dedication that humans have been trying for centuries to pry it from his grasp? One interpretation found within the folklore is that the leprechaun doesn't need the gold at all. He hoards it not because it has any practical value to him, but because he is, at heart, a miser. The gold is an end in itself, something to be accumulated and protected, defended against all comers not because of what it can buy but because it is his hard-earned wages, his proof of countless centuries of skilled labor. To give it up would be to give up a piece of himself, to diminish the tangible record of his work. And there is another possibility too. The gold is a lure, a trap, a tool in the leprechaun's endless game with humanity. For the knowledge that leprechauns possess treasure draws humans to seek them out, to try to capture them, to match wits with them in pursuit of riches. And this gives the leprechaun opportunities to display his cleverness, to outwit and humiliate his would-be captors, to demonstrate that he is smarter, quicker, and more cunning than any mere mortal. The gold, in this interpretation, is bait. The real game is the chase, the contest of wits, the satisfaction of once again proving that no human can match a leprechaun when it comes to trickery. The leprechaun's dedication to his craft speaks to something fundamental in Irish culture: the respect for skilled work, for the transformation of raw materials into useful and beautiful objects, for the pride that comes from doing something well. In a pre-industrial society, craftsmen like cobblers were essential members of the community. They possessed knowledge and skills that others lacked, and they could be proud of their work in a way that transcended simple economics. The leprechaun, in his endless cobbling, embodies this pride pushed to its ultimate extreme, a being who has been perfecting his craft for so long that he has literally become immortal at it, the master cobbler of the other world, whose skills will never fade because he himself will never die. And yet, for all his skill, for all his dedication to his craft, the leprechaun remains a solitary figure, working alone, speaking to no one, trusting no one. His workshop has no apprentices, no other craftsmen sharing the space and the labor. He is the fairy equivalent of the self-employed artisan, the lone craftsman who answers to no one, who works when and how he chooses, who needs nothing from anyone. In an Ireland that was increasingly collectivized, increasingly social, the leprechaun represented something else: radical individuality, the refusal to conform, the determination to go one's own way regardless of what others might think or want. This solitary nature, combined with his skill and his treasure, makes the leprechaun one of the most fascinating figures in Irish folklore. He is not a hero in the traditional sense, not a warrior or a king or a savior. He is simply a worker, a craftsman, someone who does his job and wants to be left alone. And yet, in his own way, he is as powerful as any hero, for he possesses something that everyone wants and no one can take from him without his consent. In a world of magic and danger, where gods walk the earth and monsters lurk in the shadows, the leprechaun has carved out his own niche, a small space where he can work in peace, disturbed only by the occasional foolish human who thinks they can outwit him. And in almost every case, the leprechaun wins. Because what he has, ultimately, is not just gold or skill or magic. What he has is cleverness, and in the world of Irish folklore, cleverness is the greatest treasure of all. The gold, origins and mysteries. Nothing about the leprechaun fascinates us quite like his gold. The pot of gold, hidden somewhere secret, waiting to be discovered by someone clever or lucky enough to catch its guardian. This is the heart of the leprechaun legend for most people. Children dream of finding it. Adults tell stories about it. The image is so deeply embedded in our culture that we speak of pots of gold as metaphors for any hoped-for treasure, any prize worth pursuing. But where did this gold come from? Why does a solitary fairy who makes shoes for a living possess such fabulous wealth? And what do the old stories actually tell us about this most famous of fairy treasures? The association between leprechauns and hidden gold is ancient, stretching back through centuries of Irish storytelling. But it is not, as we shall see, an association that was always central to the leprechaun legend. In the earliest references to leprechaun-like creatures, there is little mention of treasure. The Leprechauns who captured King Fergus offered him magical abilities, not gold. They traded in power and knowledge rather than in precious metals. So somewhere along the way, the leprechaun acquired his famous hoard, and the explanation for this acquisition is tied up with Ireland's turbulent history. One widely told explanation for the leprechaun's gold traces it back to the Viking raids that plagued Ireland from the late 8th century onward. According to this tradition, the Norse warriors who came in their longships were after plunder, and they found it in abundance. Ireland's monasteries, wealthy and undefended, were prime targets. The Vikings looted gold, silver, precious church vessels, illuminated manuscripts encrusted with jewels, everything of value that could be carried away. And what they did not immediately take back to their ships, they often buried for safekeeping, planning to return for it when the time was right. But the time was not always right. Warriors died in battle. Ships were lost at sea. Plans changed. And so, all across Ireland, hoards of Viking gold lay buried and forgotten, their exact locations dying with the men who had hidden them. Archaeological evidence supports this part of the narrative. To this day, treasure hoards from the Viking Age are occasionally discovered in Ireland, usually by accident, by farmers ploughing fields or construction workers digging foundations. According to the legend, it was the leprechauns who found this abandoned treasure. As beings of the earth, who dwell beneath the surface and know every stone and root and hidden space in the Irish soil, they would have discovered what humans could not. The story goes that they found the forgotten gold and made it their own. But being cunning and suspicious creatures who trust no one, they did not leave it where they found it. Instead, they reburied it, hiding it so thoroughly that no human could ever hope to find it by searching. Only by capturing a leprechaun and forcing him to reveal the location could a human hope to claim any part of this vast hidden wealth. This explanation for the leprechaun's treasure fits beautifully with the folklore, giving the gold a specific historical origin, while also explaining why it is so well hidden and so difficult to obtain. Whether this is the true origin or simply a story told to explain the connection between leprechauns and treasure, it has become deeply embedded in the tradition. But there are other explanations as well. Some accounts suggest that the leprechaun's gold comes from the wages he has earned over countless centuries of making shoes for the fairies. If you work for thousands of years, even a small wage per shoe would eventually add up to a considerable sum. The leprechaun, being frugal and solitary with no dependents to support and no expensive habits other than perhaps tobacco for his pipe, would have saved everything he earned. Over time, coin by coin, his wealth would have grown until it filled not just a purse but a pot, a treasure hoard accumulated 1 shilling at a time. William Butler Yeats offered his own theory about leprechaun wealth. He suggested that the great wealth of leprechauns and other solitary fairies comes from the treasure crocks buried of old in wartime, which they have uncovered and appropriated. This interpretation is broader than the Viking theory, encompassing treasure from any period, from any conflict. Ireland's history is long and violent, full of invasions and rebellions and wars between rival clans and kingdoms. In every war, treasure was hidden, sometimes to be reclaimed later, often to be forgotten. According to this view, the fairies, with their long memories and their intimate knowledge of the land, would know where all of it lay buried. Some traditions speak of the leprechaun possessing not just gold coins but a magical purse, a small pouch that contains a single shilling. This seems like a paltry treasure until you learn the purse's secret. No matter how often you take out the shilling, you will find another one inside when you reach in again. It is a never-empty purse, a source of infinite money, or at least infinite shillings. This magical object appears in several Irish fairy tales, not always associated with leprechauns specifically, but often connected to the fairy folk in general. The purse represents a kind of fairy economics that operates on principles completely different from human commerce, where scarcity does not exist and wealth can be literally inexhaustible. The question of why the leprechaun hoards his gold, given that he has no apparent use for it, is one that has puzzled many who have studied the folklore. Various interpretations have been offered. Some scholars suggest that the gold serves primarily as a test, a way of measuring human character. The leprechaun's treasure tempts humans, drawing out their greed and their willingness to do anything to get rich. In this reading, the leprechaun functions less as a miser than as a moral guardian, using his gold to reveal the true nature of those who pursue it. Others have proposed that the leprechaun's relationship with his gold is not rational but emotional. He is attached to it not for what it can buy but for what it represents: his independence, his security, his proof that he needs nothing from anyone. To give up his gold would be to admit vulnerability, to acknowledge that others have power over him. So he guards it fiercely, not because he is greedy but because he is proud. There is also the possibility, mentioned earlier, that the gold is simply part of the game the leprechaun plays with humanity. He hoards it not because he values it but because humans do, and their valuation makes it useful as bait. The real pleasure for the leprechaun comes not from possessing gold, but from outwitting those who try to take it from him. In this view, the gold is a prop in an elaborate performance, valuable only insofar as it motivates humans to engage with the leprechaun on his terms. The physical form of the treasure varies in different accounts. Most commonly, it is described as a pot or crock, an earthenware container filled with gold coins. But some stories speak of a leather purse, others of a wooden chest, still others of gold simply buried loose in the ground. The pot of gold has become the standard image, popularized through countless retellings, but the authentic folklore was more varied in its descriptions. The location of the treasure is equally variable and usually impossible to verify. It is buried beneath a tree, but which tree? There are thousands of trees in Ireland. It is hidden in a cave, but which cave? It lies at the end of a rainbow, but rainbows have no end, and even if they did, they move as you move, making it impossible to reach their termination point. The vagueness of these locations is part of the point. The treasure is hidden somewhere, but the somewhere is so poorly defined that you could search for a lifetime and never find it. Only the leprechaun knows the precise spot, and he is not telling. Some accounts suggest that each leprechaun has his own individual hoard, his personal treasure accumulated over his own lifetime. Others imply that there is a shared leprechaun treasury, a communal wealth that belongs to all leprechauns collectively. Still others hint at multiple treasures scattered across Ireland, with different leprechauns guarding different hordes. The truth, if there is a truth, is lost in the mists of folklore, where different storytellers told different versions and no single authoritative account exists. What is consistent across virtually all accounts is that the leprechaun will do anything to avoid giving up his gold. He will lie, cheat, deceive, and trick in any way he can to keep his treasure from falling into human hands. The gold may tempt humans, but it is also what makes the leprechaun most vulnerable. It is the reason humans seek him out, the thing he must constantly defend. In a sense, the leprechaun is enslaved by his own treasure, bound to it, unable to enjoy it freely because he must always be on guard against those who would steal it. This paradox, that great wealth brings not freedom but worry, is a theme that appears throughout folklore and literature. The leprechaun, in his relationship with his gold, embodies this paradox perfectly. He is rich beyond imagining, yet he cannot spend his riches. He possesses treasure, but the treasure also possesses him, defining his existence and limiting his peace. It is a cautionary tale dressed up as a fairy story, a reminder that the pursuit of wealth for its own sake leads not to happiness but to a life spent in constant defense of what one has accumulated. And perhaps this is the deepest purpose of the leprechaun's gold in Irish folklore, not to be found, not to be claimed, but to teach. The gold teaches that seeking riches through trickery or force rather than honest labor is a fool's errand. It teaches that greed makes fools of even the cleverest people. It teaches that the quick path to wealth is usually a path to nowhere, or worse, to humiliation and loss. And it teaches that true wealth lies not in what you have but in how you live, not in gold hoarded but in skills mastered, in work done well, in a life lived according to your own principles. The leprechaun, sitting under his hedge with his hammer and his leather, working away at his craft, is far richer than any treasure hunter will ever be. Not because he has gold, though he does, but because he has something more valuable. He has his skills, his independence, and his freedom to work as he chooses. The gold is almost beside the point, a distraction, a red herring that draws attention away from what truly matters. And in this way, the leprechaun's gold serves its ultimate purpose. It reveals who we are by showing us what we value, and in revealing that, it offers us the chance, if we are wise enough to take it, to question our values and perhaps to choose differently. Rainbow connection, myth versus reality. Few images are more iconic than the leprechaun's pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It is a picture that appears on countless St. Patrick's Day decorations, in children's books, on posters and greeting cards and cereal boxes. The rainbow arcing through the sky, its end touching the earth at some distant point, and there, at that precise spot, a black pot overflowing with golden coins, guarded by a small figure in green. It is an image so familiar that it seems like it must have ancient roots, must be part of the original leprechaun folklore stretching back centuries. But here is a surprising truth. It is not. The association between leprechauns and rainbows is actually quite modern, a 20th century invention that has become so widespread that many people now assume it was always part of the tradition. In authentic Irish folklore, in the stories collected in the 18th and 19th centuries from people who genuinely believed in leprechauns, there is virtually no mention of rainbows. The leprechaun's gold is hidden beneath a tree, or in a cave, or buried in a field, or tucked away in some other terrestrial location. But rainbows, they simply do not appear in the old tales. This is a case where modern popular culture has completely rewritten folklore, adding an element that was never there originally, and making that added element so central that it has eclipsed the authentic traditions. So where did the rainbow connection come from? The answer seems to lie in a conflation of two separate pieces of folklore that originally had nothing to do with each other. On one hand, we have the Irish leprechaun with his hidden gold. On the other hand, we have a piece of Germanic folklore about treasures found at the ends of rainbows. These two traditions, neither originally connected to the other, eventually merged in the popular imagination, particularly in America, and the leprechaun ended up forever associated with rainbows. The rainbow folklore appears in various forms across Northern Europe, not in Ireland. An 1851 book on Northern mythology notes that according to a popular belief in Germany, Denmark, and England, a golden cup or hidden treasure lies where the rainbow apparently touches the ground. This is not Irish in origin. It is a broader European tradition, one that sees the rainbow as a kind of pointer or marker, a natural phenomenon that indicates the location of something valuable. The reasoning seems to be that rainbows are rare and beautiful, appearing only under certain atmospheric conditions, and their appearance must therefore mean something, must mark something special about the place where they occur. But here is the problem: rainbows do not actually have ends. They are optical illusions, created by sunlight refracting through water droplets in the atmosphere. The rainbow you see is unique to your position, angle, and viewpoint. Move, and the rainbow appears to move with you. Walk toward it, and it retreats at the same rate you advance. You can never actually reach a rainbow, much less find a pot of gold waiting there, because the rainbow is not a physical object with a location. It is an effect, a trick of light and water, beautiful but fundamentally intangible. The Irish people, with their long tradition of close observation of nature, would have understood this well. An old Irish saying captures exactly this understanding: you are as likely to find a pot of gold as you are to find the end of the rainbow. That is to say, both are impossible. The saying uses the impossibility of reaching the rainbow's end as a metaphor for any other impossible quest. This suggests that in Ireland, the rainbow's end was already understood as unreachable long before it became associated with leprechaun gold. So when did this metaphor get literalized? When did the unreachable end of the rainbow become the actual hiding place for the leprechaun's actual gold? The evidence suggests this happened primarily in the early to mid-20th century, particularly in America as Irish folklore was being repackaged for popular consumption. A critical moment appears to have come in 1947 with the Broadway musical Finian's Rainbow, by E.Y. Harburg and Burton Lane. This musical, which was a significant success running for 725 performances and later being adapted into a 1968 film, featured a plot about a pot of gold that an Irishman named Finian McLonergan stole from a leprechaun and brought to America, hoping to bury it near Fort Knox so that the gold would multiply. The musical's title explicitly links leprechauns with rainbows, and its success helped to cement this connection in American popular culture. From there, the association spread and intensified. By the 1950s and 1960s, as leprechauns became commercialized and commodified, particularly around St. Patrick's Day, the rainbow had become an essential part of the image. You could not have one without the other. There is something poignant about this development. The authentic folklore, with its emphasis on the leprechaun as a crabby cobbler working alone, guarding gold buried in ordinary places through supernatural cunning, has been replaced by a more fantastical image that is, paradoxically, less magical. For there is a kind of magic in the original stories, a sense that the leprechaun belongs to the real Irish landscape, to the hedges and fields and hidden corners of an actual country. He is not off in some impossible location at the end of an optical illusion. He is here, nearby, just out of sight, making his shoes and guarding his gold in some spot you might actually find if only you were clever enough. The rainbow, beautiful as it is, distances the leprechaun. It places him in an impossible location, makes his treasure explicitly unattainable. In doing so, it transforms the leprechaun from a being who might actually exist, who might actually be encountered if you were observant and lucky, into something that is obviously fantasy, obviously unreal. The rainbow admits what the original folklore never admitted, that this is all just a story, that no one will ever really catch a leprechaun or claim his gold. And yet, the rainbow image has its own attractions. It is beautiful, for one thing. The arc of colors stretching across the sky, the small figure at its end, the golden treasure, these make for a striking visual that is easy to reproduce and instantly recognizable. The rainbow also carries its own symbolism. Hope, promise, the idea that something wonderful waits at journey's end. By placing the leprechaun at the rainbow's end, the modern image associates him with these positive meanings, making him a symbol of hope rather than the morally ambiguous trickster of authentic folklore. The rainbow connection has also given rise to one of the most common leprechaun-related activities in modern times, the leprechaun trap. Children, particularly in schools and homes celebrating St. Patrick's Day, build elaborate traps designed to catch a leprechaun. These traps often incorporate rainbows, both as decoration and as lures, on the theory that leprechauns are attracted to rainbows. It is a charming activity, creative and fun, but it is based entirely on modern invention rather than authentic folklore. The original leprechaun would have been more likely to be found by sound than by sight, located through patient listening for that telltale tapping of his hammer, not by leaving out rainbow-themed bait. There is a deeper irony here as well. The rainbow, as we have established, has no end that can be reached. It is therefore the perfect symbol for an impossible quest, for a goal that recedes as you approach it. The leprechaun, however, could theoretically be caught, according to the old stories. He is tricky and clever, but he is not impossible. The stories are full of accounts of people who successfully captured leprechauns, at least temporarily. But by placing the leprechaun at the rainbow's end, we make catching him truly impossible, or at least we make finding his treasure so. We transform the leprechaun from a difficult but theoretically possible challenge into an explicitly impossible one. Perhaps this is actually appropriate. Perhaps the rainbow connection, modern invention though it is, actually captures something true about the leprechaun legend. That his gold was never really meant to be found, that the treasure is ultimately a mirage, that the real point of the story is the chase rather than the capture. The rainbow, constantly moving, forever out of reach, is the perfect metaphor for the leprechaun's gold, which even when you think you have located it, will vanish or be revealed as illusion or be guarded by such cunning that you cannot claim it. So while the rainbow connection is not authentic folklore in the traditional sense, while it was grafted onto the leprechaun legend from outside sources and for commercial reasons, it has nonetheless become folklore in its own right. Children grow up believing that leprechauns and rainbows go together, and this belief, passed from generation to generation, becomes a kind of modern folk tradition. It may not be ancient, but it is now widespread and deeply ingrained. In another century or two, will anyone remember that the association was once new? Will scholars of the future have to explain that leprechauns did not always have anything to do with rainbows, that this was a 20th century innovation? Perhaps they will, and perhaps by then yet another element will have been added to the legend, some new detail that seems so natural and so obvious that it will be hard to believe it was not always there. This is how folklore works, after all. It is not fixed or static but constantly evolving, constantly adapting to new circumstances, new meanings, new needs. The leprechaun of the 8th century was very different from the leprechaun of the 18th century, who was in turn quite different from the leprechaun of the 21st century. And each version, in its time, has been authentic, has been the leprechaun that people believed in and told stories about. The rainbow may be a modern addition, but it is now part of the story, and that gives it a legitimacy of its own, the legitimacy of being believed, of being retold, of capturing imaginations and becoming part of how we think about these magical beings. Catching a leprechaun, tales and trickery. If you want to become rich beyond your wildest dreams, Irish folklore offers you a solution: catch a leprechaun. Force him to reveal the location of his hidden treasure, and all that gold can be yours. It sounds simple enough. The leprechaun is tiny, no bigger than a child, and you are a full-grown human with all the advantages of size and strength. How hard could it be? But as countless stories make clear, catching a leprechaun is one of the most difficult challenges you will ever face. And even if you succeed in catching one, making him give up his gold is harder still. For the leprechaun's greatest treasure is not his gold but his cleverness, and that cleverness has saved him from capture time and time again. The first challenge is finding a leprechaun at all. They are solitary creatures who prefer remote areas, far from human habitation. They have supernatural senses that alert them to danger. They can make themselves invisible or blend into their surroundings with extraordinary skill. Your best chance, according to the folklore, is not to search with your eyes but with your ears. Listen for that distinctive tapping sound, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the leprechaun's hammer as he works on his shoe. This is the sound that might lead you to him, if you can follow it quietly enough and approach carefully enough that he does not hear you coming. Some traditions hold that leprechauns can be found most easily at twilight, during those liminal hours when day fades into night and the boundary between this world and the other world grows thin. Others suggest looking near fairy forts, those circular earthen mounds that dot the Irish countryside and mark the entrances to the fairy realm. Still others speak of finding leprechauns under hedgerows, particularly dock leaves and hawthorn bushes, places where a small creature could work in relative concealment. Once you have located a leprechaun, the next challenge is catching him. This requires speed, stealth, and above all else, a firm grip. The most common advice from the folklore is to grab the leprechaun around the neck, grasping him tightly, but not so tightly that you hurt him. You must not grab him by his clothing, as he will simply wriggle free and disappear, leaving you holding an empty coat. The grip must be on the leprechaun himself, skin to skin if possible, firm enough that he cannot escape but gentle enough that you are not strangling him. And here is where it gets tricky. Once you have caught a leprechaun, you must never, under any circumstances, take your eyes off him. The moment you look away, even for an instant, the leprechaun will vanish. This is one of the most consistent elements across all leprechaun stories. The leprechaun can only escape your sight if you break your gaze. As long as you keep looking at him, he is bound to remain, solid and real and unable to use his magic to disappear. But one blink, one glance aside, and he will be gone, and you will never find him again. This creates an immediate problem. If you have caught a leprechaun and are demanding that he show you where his gold is hidden, he must lead you to that location. You must follow him, walking through fields or forests, climbing hills, crossing streams, all while keeping your eyes fixed on him every single moment. Try doing that sometime. Try walking across rough ground, avoiding obstacles and hazards, all while never looking anywhere but at a single point directly in front of you. It is nearly impossible, which is of course the point. The leprechaun, for his part, is under certain obligations once caught. This is another consistent element of the folklore. The leprechaun must either grant wishes or reveal the location of his treasure to the person who has captured him. Different stories give different numbers of wishes, most commonly 3, though sometimes only 1. The leprechaun cannot simply refuse or kill his captor, though he might threaten to do so. He is bound by the rules of the fairy world to offer something of value in exchange for his freedom. But, and this is crucial, he is under no obligation to be truthful, helpful, or straightforward. He will offer what is required, but he will do so in whatever way allows him to escape with his treasure intact. And he is very, very good at this. The leprechaun is a master of misdirection, of clever wording, of finding loopholes in any agreement. He will use every trick at his disposal to ensure that even if you technically get what was promised, you end up with nothing of value. The stories are full of examples of the leprechaun's trickery. One of the most famous involves a farmer who managed to catch a leprechaun and force him to show where his gold was buried. The leprechaun led the farmer to a particular ragwort plant in a field and admitted that his treasure lay beneath that very plant. But the farmer had no shovel with him, and he could not dig up the gold with his bare hands. He needed to go home and fetch a spade. Realizing he could not remember which plant it was among hundreds of similar plants, the farmer had an idea. He took off his red scarf and tied it around the ragwort plant, marking the spot. Then he made the leprechaun promise not to remove the scarf. The leprechaun readily agreed. After all, the promise was only about the scarf on that particular plant. The farmer ran home, grabbed his shovel, and hurried back to the field, certain that his fortune was secured. But when he returned, he found that every single ragwort plant in the entire field now sported a red scarf identical to his own. Hundreds of scarves, perhaps thousands, each one marking a potential spot. The leprechaun had kept his promise. He had not touched the original scarf, but he had placed identical scarves on all the other plants, making it impossible to identify the right one. The farmer could have dug up the entire field, plant by plant, but it would have taken him months, and the leprechaun's gold might not even be there anymore. The leprechaun, needless to say, was long gone, cackling with glee at his own cleverness. This story illustrates perfectly the leprechaun's method. He complied with the letter of the agreement while completely undermining its spirit. He fulfilled his obligation while ensuring that fulfillment brought no benefit to his captor. It is a masterclass in trickery, and it is the reason why virtually every story of someone catching a leprechaun ends with the person walking away empty-handed, often feeling rather foolish for having believed it would be different in their case. Another common trick the leprechaun employs is distraction. He will suddenly shout that there is something terrible behind you, a monster or a danger that requires immediate attention. Or he will claim to see smoke rising from the direction of your home, suggesting that your house is on fire. Or he will point out some supposedly valuable object just at the edge of your vision, something so tempting that you cannot resist glancing at it. In every case, the goal is the same, to make you look away, just for a moment. And that moment is all he needs. The distraction technique often plays on human greed, which the leprechaun understands very well. He might claim to see a much larger treasure nearby, one that would make his own pot of gold seem insignificant. He might suggest that if you are interested in gold, you should really be looking over there, where an entire chest of it lies exposed. The temptation to look, to verify, to check if perhaps there is an even better prize available, this temptation is almost irresistible. And of course, the moment you look, the leprechaun is gone. Some stories describe leprechauns using more dramatic forms of distraction. In one tale, a man who had caught a leprechaun suddenly heard the most terrible scream imaginable, a sound that seemed to split the very heavens. What was that? The man cried out in alarm, and of course he looked up to see where such a sound could have come from. In that instant, the leprechaun vanished. When the man asked him later, having, in the story, managed to catch him a second time, what had made that terrible noise, the leprechaun admitted that he himself had made it, using his magical voice to create a distraction so frightening that any human would involuntarily look toward it. There are also accounts of leprechauns physically attacking their captors, though this is less common. The leprechaun might pinch, bite, or scratch, trying to cause enough pain that the captor's grip loosens for just a moment. These physical tactics are usually last resorts, employed only when more subtle forms of trickery have failed. The leprechaun prefers to outwit rather than outfight, but he is not above using force if necessary. In some stories, the leprechaun offers his captor a choice between his treasure and his magical purse, the one that always contains a shilling no matter how many times you take one out. The captor, greedy for the larger treasure, chooses the pot of gold. But the leprechaun then explains that the gold is buried very far away, across difficult terrain, and the journey will be long and arduous. Would the captor not prefer the purse, which is here right now and requires no digging. Many captors, realizing the practical difficulties of their choice, agree to take the purse instead. And the moment they take it, the moment their hand reaches for the purse and their attention shifts from the leprechaun to the object, the leprechaun disappears, and often the purse disappears with him or transforms into something worthless. A few stories, a very few, describe people who actually succeeded in getting treasure from a leprechaun. But even in these rare cases, there is usually a caveat, a catch, a price to be paid. The treasure might be cursed, bringing misfortune to its possessor. Or it might be fairy gold, which looks real but transforms into worthless dross once the leprechaun is out of sight. Or the person might receive one genuine gold coin, but then spend the rest of their life searching for more, never satisfied, never content, driven by greed into poverty and obsession. The message underlying all these stories is clear. The leprechaun's gold is not meant to be claimed. It serves as a test, a way of revealing human character. Those who seek it are motivated by greed, by the desire to gain wealth without earning it, by the hope of getting something for nothing. And they are punished for this greed, not by the leprechaun taking revenge, though he certainly enjoys outwitting them, but by their own foolishness, their own inability to resist temptation, their own failure to see the obvious truth that if getting rich were as simple as catching a leprechaun, everyone would already be rich. The leprechaun, in these stories, is less a villain than a teacher. He teaches that cleverness beats strength, that greed makes fools of everyone, that easy riches are an illusion, and that the only real wealth comes from honest work. The cobbler at his trade, making shoes with skill and patience, is far richer than the treasure hunter who wastes his time chasing fairy gold. This is the lesson. It has been the lesson for centuries. And yet, in the stories, people keep trying to catch leprechauns, keep falling for the same tricks, keep walking away empty-handed. Because that too is part of human nature, the eternal hope that this time, surely, it will be different. This time, we will be clever enough. This time, we will beat the leprechaun at his own game. And of course, we never do. Fairy cousins, Clorishorn and Fardarig. The leprechaun does not stand alone in Irish folklore. He has cousins, relatives, fellow members of the fairy folk who share certain characteristics with him, but who are distinct enough to be recognized as separate beings. These fairy cousins help us understand the leprechaun better by showing us what he is not, by providing contrasts that highlight what makes the leprechaun unique. The two most important of these relatives are the Clorishorn and the Fardarig, both solitary fairies like the leprechaun, but with their own particular personalities and peculiarities. The Clorishorn, whose name is usually pronounced Kluricorn, is in many ways the leprechaun's dark twin. Some folklorists have suggested that the Clorishorn is simply a leprechaun on a drinking binge, the same creature but in a different mood or state. There is some evidence for this theory in the folklore itself, which sometimes blurs the line between the two beings, describing characteristics that could apply to either one. But traditional accounts treat them as separate entities, related but distinct, like brothers from the same family who have taken very different paths in life. Where the leprechaun is a worker, industrious and dedicated to his craft, the Clorishorn is idle and dissolute. He has no trade, no occupation, nothing productive to do with his time. Instead, he spends his days and particularly his nights drinking. The Clorishorn is almost always depicted as drunk or in the process of getting drunk, a small figure swaying on unsteady legs, often with a cup or bottle in hand. He inhabits wine cellars and storage areas where alcohol is kept, helping himself freely to whatever is available. In appearance, the Clorishorn is sometimes described as wearing red or purple rather than the leprechaun's green or red, though accounts vary. Some describe him as taller than a leprechaun, though still small by human standards. Others give him finer features, sometimes even calling him elegant or handsome, though his constant state of intoxication mars whatever good looks he might possess. His face is often red from drink, his eyes bloodshot, his movements clumsy and unpredictable. The Leprechaun's behavior is decidedly antisocial. While the leprechaun prefers to be left alone but is not actively malicious, the Leprechaun delights in causing trouble. He will terrorize households, riding sheep and dogs through the night like a drunken jockey, leaving livestock exhausted and traumatized by morning. He tangles fishing lines, spoils food, breaks dishes, and generally makes life miserable for anyone unfortunate enough to have a Leprechaun take up residence in their home. If you anger a Leprechaun, which is easy to do, the consequences can be severe. He might curse you with poverty, illness, or other misfortunes. One account describes a Leprechaun who, when offended, caused the wine in his host's cellar to go sour and the business to fail. The only way to appease an angry Leprechaun is through offerings of alcohol and patient tolerance of his antics, accepting the havoc he causes as the price for his presence. Interestingly, some stories suggest that if you treat a Leprechaun well, providing him with good drink and not interfering with his nighttime activities, he might actually help you. He has knowledge of hidden treasures, much like the leprechaun, and can be forced, or occasionally convinced, to reveal their locations. He also knows the secret of making beer from heather, a lost art that some say produced the finest ale ever brewed. But such helpful behavior from a Leprechaun is rare. Usually, he is simply a nuisance, a drain on your resources, a creature to be avoided if possible and tolerated if not. The Fairies, whose name means red man in Irish, Fear-dig, is another solitary fairy related to the leprechaun but with a far more sinister reputation. Where the leprechaun's tricks are generally harmless if frustrating, and the Leprechaun's behavior is mostly just drunken mischief, the Fairies' idea of fun tends toward the genuinely frightening and sometimes cruel. He is a darker figure, one who takes pleasure in terrifying humans, in playing pranks that go beyond mere annoyance into something approaching torture. The Fairies is identified by his clothing. He wears red from head to toe, a red coat and cap that give him his name. Some accounts describe him as looking somewhat like a rat, with a dark complexion, a heavy build, and sometimes even a tail. He is not handsome or elegant but rough and crude in appearance, suited to his rough and crude sense of humor. The Fairies' favorite activity is what might be called practical jokes, though that term seems too mild for what he actually does. He might lead travelers into bogs or off cliffs. He might appear in people's homes at night and tell them terrible stories, filling their dreams with nightmares. He has been known to ask humans to help him with various tasks that turn out to be deeply disturbing, involving corpses or other horrific sights meant to shock and terrify. There is a traditional phrase one can use when encountering a Fairy: "You will not mock me." Saying this is supposed to break his power, to send him away or at least prevent him from carrying out his worst pranks. It is an acknowledgement that you know what he is and what he is trying to do, a refusal to play the victim in his game. Whether this phrase actually works is, of course, impossible to verify, but its existence in the folklore suggests that people genuinely feared the Fairy and sought any means of protection against him. Despite his fearsome reputation, the Fairy is not entirely evil. He is mischievous and cruel by nature, but he does not seem to intend permanent harm. His pranks, however terrifying, generally end with the victim alive and physically unharmed, if psychologically scarred. He is testing humans, pushing them to see how they will react to fear, perhaps judging their character through their responses to horror. Those who face his trials with courage and maintain their composure may win his respect, though this is small comfort to those who encounter him. The relationship between the leprechaun, the Leprechaun, and the Fairy is subject to various interpretations. Some folklorists believe they are genuinely separate beings, three different types of solitary fairy that happen to share certain characteristics. Others have argued that they could be aspects of the same being: the leprechaun at work, the chlorishorn at play, and the fairies when he is in a particularly dark mood. One particularly creative interpretation suggests they might represent life stages, with the fairies being a young leprechaun in his reckless youth, the leprechaun being the same being in his productive middle years, and the chlorishorn being the leprechaun in his retirement, having given up work for drink. However, this life stages theory is more modern speculation than traditional folklore. Geography may also play a role. Different regions of Ireland had different traditions, and what was called a leprechaun in one county might be called a chlorishorn or fairies in another. The differences between the three might be more a matter of local variation than of genuine separate categories. A story that travelled from Cork in the south to Donegal in the north would have been transformed along the way, adapted to local beliefs and terminology, so that a chlorishorn story might become a fairies story or a leprechaun story depending on who was telling it and where. What all three share is their solitary nature. Unlike the trooping fairies who move in groups and hold courts and engage in the social activities of the fairy realm, the leprechaun, chlorishorn, and fairies are loners. They work alone, live alone, and encounter humans alone. This solitary quality sets them apart from most other Irish fairies and gives them a particular character. They are independent, unpredictable, and answerable to no one but themselves. They also all share a connection to human spaces, appearing in or near human habitations more often than many other fairies. The leprechaun works near hedges and fields where humans farm. The chlorishorn haunts wine cellars and storage buildings. The fairies may appear inside homes or on roads that humans travel. They inhabit the boundaries between the fairy world and the human world, existing in proximity to human life even as they remain apart from it. And all three, in their different ways, test humans. The leprechaun tests greed and cleverness. The chlorishorn tests patience and tolerance. The fairies tests courage and composure. They are not simply tricksters for the sake of trickery, but beings who reveal human nature through their interactions with us. In encountering them, we encounter aspects of ourselves, our desires and fears and weaknesses. And perhaps this is why these three solitary fairies have endured in folklore while many other fairy beings have faded into obscurity. They tell us something about who we are. Modern transformation and commercialization. The leprechaun you see today, grinning from cereal boxes and parade floats, decorating pubs and greeting cards, has travelled a long distance from his origins in Irish folklore. This journey, from authentic folk belief to commercial icon, is a story of cultural transformation, of how immigration, mass media, and market forces can reshape traditional narratives into something new. It is a story of both loss and gain, of elements that have been forgotten and new elements that have been added, of a figure who has become more famous than ever but in many ways less interesting than he once was. The transformation began in earnest in the 19th century, when folklorists and writers began to collect and publish Irish fairy tales. Before this period, leprechaun lore existed primarily in oral tradition, passed down through generations in rural communities. Each storyteller added their own embellishments, each region had its own variations, but the stories remained rooted in genuine folk belief. People who told stories about leprechauns often genuinely believed in them, or at least claimed to have encountered them or know someone who had. The act of writing these stories down, of fixing them in print, changed their nature. Oral stories are fluid, adapting to each telling, responsive to the audience and the teller's mood. Written stories are frozen, permanent, the same every time they are read. This fixation brought clarity and standardization, but at the cost of that rich variability that characterized the oral tradition. The leprechaun in books was more consistent than the leprechaun of fireside tales, but also less alive, less able to adapt and change. Then came the great waves of Irish immigration, particularly to America. Fleeing famine and poverty in the mid-19th century, millions of Irish people carried their culture with them to new lands. They brought their music, their dance, their stories, and their holidays. Among these was St. Patrick's Day, originally a religious feast day, but transformed in America into a celebration of Irish identity and heritage. And as St. Patrick's Day grew in prominence, particularly in cities with large Irish populations like Boston, New York, and Chicago, the leprechaun came along for the ride. In America, the leprechaun was freed from his original context. He was no longer part of a living folk tradition, but a symbol, a representative of Irishness in general. And as a symbol, he could be modified, simplified, made more appealing and less complex. The cranky cobbler of authentic folklore became a friendlier figure. His red coat was replaced with green to match the color associated with Ireland and St. Patrick's Day. His wrinkled, ancient face was softened into something more approachable. He was transformed from a genuine fairy into a mascot. This transformation accelerated in the 20th century with the rise of mass media. The 1959 Disney film Darby O'Gill and the Little People presented leprechauns as whimsical and generally benevolent, if occasionally mischievous. The film was popular and influential, shaping how many Americans thought about leprechauns. Then came Lucky the Leprechaun, mascot of Lucky Charms cereal, introduced in 1964. This cartoon leprechaun, with his magical marshmallow charms and his catchphrase "They are magically delicious," became one of the most recognizable advertising characters in America. Millions of children grew up seeing Lucky every morning at breakfast, and for many of them, this cartoon character was their primary exposure to leprechaun lore. St. Patrick's Day, meanwhile, continued to evolve and expand. What had been primarily an Irish and Irish-American holiday became, in many places, a general celebration in which people of all backgrounds participated. The wearing of green, the drinking of green beer, the decorations featuring shamrocks and leprechauns, these became standard elements of the holiday's observance. And with this broadening came further simplification. The leprechaun became a generic symbol of luck and Irishness, stripped of most of the complexity and edge that characterized the original folklore. There has been significant pushback against this commercialization, particularly from Irish people and scholars of Irish culture. They point out that the modern image of the leprechaun bears little resemblance to the authentic folklore, that it has become a caricature, and sometimes a demeaning one. The green-clad, red-bearded, perpetually cheerful leprechaun of modern marketing has been compared to minstrel show stereotypes, a crude ethnic caricature that reduces a rich cultural tradition to a few simple, often offensive images. Critics note that the leprechaun's association with drinking, particularly in St. Patrick's Day celebrations, reinforces negative stereotypes about Irish people and alcohol. They object to the leprechaun being used to sell products, from breakfast cereal to car insurance, arguing that this commodification degrades what was once a meaningful part of Irish spiritual life. And they resent the way that modern leprechaun imagery has so thoroughly displaced the authentic folklore that many people now have no idea what the original stories were actually like. There is truth to these criticisms. The leprechaun has been simplified, commercialized, and in many ways diminished. The complex figure of Irish folklore has become a two-dimensional cartoon character, reduced to a handful of recognizable traits and deployed endlessly in commercial and decorative contexts that have nothing to do with his original meanings or purposes. For those who care about preserving authentic Irish culture, this transformation is a loss, a kind of cultural theft in which the real leprechaun has been stolen and replaced with a pale imitation. And yet, there is another way to look at this transformation. Folklore has always changed and adapted. The leprechaun of the 19th century was already different from the Lucapane of the 8th century. The stories told in Cork were different from those told in Donegal. Folklore is living tradition, constantly evolving in response to changing circumstances and needs. The commercialization of the leprechaun, however unfortunate in some respects, is simply the latest stage in this ongoing evolution. Moreover, the modern leprechaun, simplified though he may be, has achieved a kind of immortality through his commercialization. How many other fairy folk from Irish tradition are recognized around the world? How many are known to people who have never been to Ireland, who know nothing of Irish culture beyond a few basic symbols? The banshee has some recognition, perhaps, and the puka appears occasionally in fantasy literature. But the leprechaun is known everywhere, instantly recognizable, a figure who has transcended his origins to become a global symbol. This ubiquity has a price, certainly, but it also means that the leprechaun, in some form, will endure. Children who grow up watching Lucky the Leprechaun might, as adults, become curious about the real folklore behind the character. They might seek out the authentic stories, discover the complexity that has been hidden beneath the commercial veneer, and in doing so, help to preserve and transmit that authentic tradition to new generations. The simplified version can serve as a gateway to the richer, more complex original. There are also efforts underway to reclaim and restore authentic leprechaun lore. Folklorists, writers, and cultural organizations in Ireland are working to document and share the traditional stories, to separate folklore from commercial invention, to help people understand what the leprechaun really was in the context of Irish culture. These efforts cannot undo the commercialization, but they can provide an alternative, can ensure that the authentic tradition is not entirely lost beneath the layers of modern adaptation. The story of the leprechaun's transformation is, in the end, a story about how cultures change when they move and mix, when they encounter mass media and mass markets. It is a story about what is lost and what is gained in these encounters, about the tension between preserving tradition and adapting to new circumstances. There are no easy answers, no simple judgments to be made. The leprechaun of modern popular culture is both more and less than the leprechaun of traditional folklore, more famous but less authentic, more accessible but less interesting, more loved but less understood. Perhaps the best we can do is to acknowledge both versions, to appreciate the modern leprechaun for what he is while also remembering and honoring what he was. To enjoy the whimsy of lucky charms and St. Patrick's Day celebrations while also studying the authentic folklore, seeking out the old stories, learning about the real beliefs and traditions from which the modern image emerged. In this way, we can have both, the leprechaun as commercial icon and cultural ambassador, and the leprechaun as genuine fairy folk, as piece of living tradition, as a window into how Irish people once understood the world around them. Conclusion: the enduring magic. And so, dear friends, we come to the end of our journey through the mists of leprechaun lore. We have travelled from the divine halls of the Tuatha Dé Danann down to the humble hedgerows where solitary cobblers ply their trade. We have traced the transformation of gods into fairies, examined the many names by which the leprechaun has been known, and explored the complex relationship between authentic folklore and modern commercialization. We have learned about the pot of gold and the rainbow, about the cunning tricks and the impossible quests, about the cousins and relatives who share the leprechaun's nature if not his exact form. What have we discovered? That the leprechaun is far more interesting and complex than his modern image suggests. That he is not a simple lucky charm or a cute mascot, but a figure who embodies certain fundamental aspects of Irish culture. The respect for craftsmanship, the value placed on cleverness over strength, the understanding that the world contains mysteries that cannot be fully explained or controlled. The leprechaun represents the Irish relationship with the other world, with that realm of magic and danger that exists parallel to everyday life, separated by boundaries that are thin and sometimes permeable. The leprechaun's gold, we have learned, is less important than it seems. It is a test, a temptation, a way of revealing character. The treasure hunter who seeks the gold reveals their greed. their willingness to use force or trickery to claim what is not rightfully theirs, their hope for riches without labor. And they are invariably disappointed, sent away empty-handed, taught through their failure that there are no shortcuts to true wealth. The leprechaun himself, working at his trade, content with his craft, is far richer than any gold could make him. This is the lesson the folklore teaches, if we are wise enough to learn it. The leprechaun's tricks, similarly, are not mere mischief for mischief's sake. They serve a purpose, to protect what is his, to maintain his independence, to demonstrate that cleverness and wit are more powerful than size and strength. In a world where humans have so many advantages, where fairies are relegated to the margins and the hidden spaces, the leprechaun's ability to outwit any human who tries to capture him is an assertion of dignity, a refusal to be dominated or exploited. He may be small, but he is not weak. He may be alone, but he is not helpless. And this makes him, in his way, a kind of hero. The transformation of the leprechaun in modern times, from authentic folklore to commercial icon, is both tragedy and triumph. It is tragic that so much has been lost, that the complex figure of tradition has been simplified into a cartoon character, that genuine folk belief has been replaced by knowing irony and commercial exploitation. But it is also triumphant that the leprechaun has survived at all, that in however altered a form, he remains part of our cultural landscape, recognized and beloved around the world. How many other fairy folk can claim such endurance? Perhaps the true magic of the leprechaun lies in this very adaptability, this ability to change form without losing essence. From god to fairy to commercial mascot, through countless retellings and reimaginings, the leprechaun persists. He changes, certainly, but something fundamental remains. The small, solitary figure at his work, guarding his secrets, outwitting those who would exploit him, embodying a certain kind of Irish wit and wisdom that no amount of commercialization can entirely erase. And perhaps, in the end, this is what the leprechaun teaches us most profoundly, that stories matter, that they shape how we see the world, that they carry meanings and lessons that persist even when the stories themselves are transformed. The leprechaun may no longer be believed in as a literal being, but the values he represents, the lessons his stories teach, these remain relevant. We still need to learn about the dangers of greed, the value of honest work, the power of cleverness, the importance of respecting boundaries and mysteries. These are timeless truths, and the leprechaun, in whatever form he takes, continues to teach them. So the next time you see a leprechaun on a cereal box or a St. Patrick's Day decoration, I invite you to look past the commercialization and remember the authentic folklore. Remember the cobbler under the hedge, hammer in hand, working in solitude. Remember the treasure seeker who thought himself clever, but was outwitted once again. Remember the ancient gods who became fairies, the transformation of divine beings into small folk who nevertheless retained their dignity and their magic. Remember that every culture has its ways of understanding the world, and that fairy folklore, properly understood, is one such way, a method of encoding wisdom and preserving memory through story. The leprechaun's gold may be forever out of reach, hidden at the impossible end of an optical illusion, or buried in an unmarked spot known only to a being who will never reveal it. But the true treasure of the leprechaun legend lies not in gold at all. It lies in the stories themselves, in the rich tradition of Irish folklore, in the window these tales provide into how our ancestors understood the world. This treasure is not hidden. It is here, available to anyone who takes the time to seek it out, to learn the authentic stories, to appreciate the complexity and depth of genuine folk tradition. And so, dear friends, as we close this chapter of our journey together, I hope you will carry with you not just the commercial image of the leprechaun, but the deeper knowledge we have explored tonight. May you listen for the tap-tap-tap of tiny hammers when you walk through wild places. May you appreciate the craft and skill of makers and workers. May you value cleverness and wit. May you resist the temptation of easy riches. May you respect mysteries and boundaries. And may you remember that the world is wider and stranger than our everyday experience suggests, that magic persists in hidden corners, and that sometimes, if we are very quiet and very observant, we might just catch a glimpse of something otherworldly. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of Irish folklore. If you enjoyed our exploration of leprechauns and their hidden gold, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to Emerald Dreams for more stories from Irish mythology and Celtic folklore. May your own paths be blessed with the wisdom to recognize true treasure when you find it, and the wit to hold onto it against all temptations to trade it for lesser things. Until next time, dear adventurers, may your dreams be filled with magic, and may you always find your way home.